It's possible I misled you, as the BEACN Mic can actually sound really freaking good. I just think it takes a little bit more work, and there's some factors at play. So I want to show you how we got here and why it sounded like it did in my review. I'm EposVox, the stream professor, and I just posted my review of the BEACN Mic and got about 4 hours of sleep after 3 straight days of working on it because that's all I really had time for it. And despite the fact that I had some really cool stuff going on in that video, most of the comments were about how bad the mic sounded. And honestly, I'm kind of shocked. Like, I didn't think it sounded great, but I also don't think it sounds that offensive. All of it's processing in 32-bit float, and that is where the real magic begins. However, I can explain why it sounds the way it did. So right now you're listening to it completely flat. We've disabled everything, noise suppression and everything. And honestly, I think it sounds as I described. It's still a little compressed sounding, a little crunchy. I forgot to turn off the exciter and the de-esser and everything. All right, so this is completely flat and completely natural. I still, all my thoughts about how it originally sounded still apply. I still feel the way that I do. However, I was able to tune things after watching everyone's videos because I couldn't figure out why all the comments were so mad about it. Like, if we scroll through all the comments, it is about how bad the mic is and very little about the review itself, which is fine. Like, I think I'm more sensitive to it because I worked so hard on it, like, because it was such a crunch period and whatever. But people don't like how it sounds, and I was kind of surprised like that. So finally, I got the chance to check out some other people's reviews. I'm not calling anyone out here. If anything, I'm learning from what they did. Harris's probably sounded close to the most natural. I'd say Knackers's sounded the best here.
2, 6. Like 6, 7 seconds. So instead of just having to rely off of a single meter that just has a bouncing...
At least if you don't crank up your headphones. When I have my headphones on super high settings here, it doesn't sound great. But, at normal headphone ranges, it sounds
signal as you're talking
pretty solid. Knackers is actually really good at getting his mic audio where he wants. However, I will point out, these are some aggressive adjustments that I would not normally make and did not make on any of the other microphones I compare to. You'll also notice how close he is to the microphone. That's going to be a consistent theme and why you see me basically having my lips on it here. Now this guy sounds, his voice doesn't sound like mine, but his audio quality sounds almost identical to mine in my review.
Finally here, the BEACN Mic, the BEACN Mix, and the BEACN Mix Create.
It's got that weird frequency that sounds a little crunchy. Now Sam also, his honestly sounds okay.
4,500, and if you increase that amount, you add a...
He's a little muddy, but he's also, again, cranking these EQ curves a little bit more than I would for other microphones. And then we have Harris, where you can see here, his lips...
how powerful some of these built-in tools are to polish your voice.
Are literally touching the microphone, and he's having to angle his mic to not get those breath sounds and to not plosive it a little bit more. So here's what went on in my review. You can see in every single one of these shots, I am more than 3 inches away from the microphone, be it the paper backdrop, up close, even in this setup. This was on purpose because I don't feel these days that a lot of people want to have to eat their microphone. I feel like that era is kind of leaving, especially as the Markiplier and Joe Rogan, like, I'm going to eat my mic and have this overly boomy podcast sound kind of has died out of a trend. A lot of people are moving to not wanting this happening. So many of my questions and my feedback in my reviews are how to avoid this exact scenario. And you're benefiting from proximity effect. Proximity effect is the act of whenever you get closer to your microphone, there is a higher emphasis on the lower end frequencies, giving you a little bit more warmth and a little bit more oomph. This is something radio DJs and podcasters take advantage of to get a certain type of sound. That is also why during these mic comparisons at the end, now granted, again, my production time on this was super limited, so I didn't get to talk about it, I guess, as much as I had hoped. But like during this sample, I get full benefit of the proximity effect.
Just as a really goofy test here, we're doing the proximity effect. We're getting
I'm right up on the microphone like I am now. So what I have determined is that there is a weird frequency. If I turn on the guide here, in this broadcast range and in the 2000 hertz range, there is a weird frequency that's resonating weirdly in other people's audio systems. And I'm not sure why, but I think that's the most fatiguing part that is kind of driving people nuts. So I have figured out an EQ curve here that I think sounds a lot better because we have, as I mentioned, we have basically 3 things working against us. First and foremost, the lack of proximity effect, which means As I get more and more away from the microphone and I have to project into it, you have a lot more emphasis on the higher end frequencies coming out of my mouth, and you're losing so much of that lower end. You've got those weird frequencies that I mentioned that I think are getting overemphasized or like resonating weirdly in people's setups. And then some of it just comes down to, some of the settings. I still think that a microphone should not require a ton of super aggressive EQing in order to sound great. That is something I stand behind, and I did not do any sort of aggressive EQing with the other microphones I compared it to. Like, I think I need to emphasize that, is I did not have to do very much with those. But it also comes up to the gain staging. So I talked about the flex of the 32-bit float audio and gaining and all of that, and that's still important. However, by being further away from the microphone, I then had to turn up the gain. And now that I'm like trying to figure this out, I have learned if you crank the gain up to max, which I didn't have it at max, but if you crank it up to max, there's a fair bit of electrical noise going on here. It's hidden by the adaptive noise suppression. But if I turn that and the expander off and then we crank this up, I don't know how much it's going to come through, but there is a bunch of weird little high-pitched electrical noises coming through, and I've tried a couple different USB cables trying to make sure they're not sitting on anything they're not supposed to. It's there. So I probably had my gain like up to here because I was back further off the microphone, so I was trying to set it up like this. So between all of those factors, which mainly comes down to physics, a lot of that was at play. And there was a couple samples in the video where I had the expander set a little too aggressive, so it was doing that pulsing. But the gain staging was the main blame factor there, with some of the higher hiss going on, and then the compressor. The compressor seems to work a little differently. I don't know how. Than other compressors I've used, in that in most of my post-processing that I do with, say, most of my videos, just for context here, I think this is where I'm misleading people as well, is most of my standard videos where I'm on camera and you don't see a microphone, those are shot on a $1,000 microphone, the Sennheiser MKH416. And I have had 4 or 5 years now to learn it and maximize my processing of it. So I have the advantage of the experience, and it is a $1,000 microphone. So I kind of set people up for failure, I guess, by using such high-end gear in the first place. But typically with my post-processing, I will often go to minus 16 dB for my threshold for my gain. You're supposed to kind of get an average of like minus 3 to minus 6 dB of attenuation. But if I crank up my mic monitor here, like if you're listening to this super loudly, it's abrasive. It doesn't sound great. And I don't usually experience that with a lot of my settings. So I have had to turn this down to like minus 23-ish seems to work if I'm right up on the microphone here. Again, I just use a 4-to-1 ratio. So it's nothing super offensive in that regard. However, I will say, I think the simple versus the advanced I think they use different settings. And that's a problem. Actually, you can tell right now, if I go to simple, it has a completely different threshold. That is unacceptable. Like, if I set a setting and the software happens to kick back to simple because I think it loads it by default, it shouldn't screw with your settings. And so, given how many crashes and blue screens and whatever I had, I'm sure it got kicked over to simple a few times, and that's some of the inconsistency. Now it comes down to EQ. I've learned a little bit here, mainly from Knackers' video. If we go back to Knackers, you see here, so a lot of people were calling out in the comments that I had way too aggressive of a mids cut, and I disagree because Knackers is actually more. Knackers is great in that he builds on the classic strategy that everyone should honestly go with, is that you cut before you boost. And so he starts cutting and then only boosts like a tiny bit here. And in fact, I could probably turn this down a little bit. That might sound a little better. I'm not sure at this point. I'm messing with things that I had working. But then he also has this big O cut at 2000 hertz, which I have never done before. But by doing it, it does seem to improve things. So I'm going to do the frequency sweeping where I sweep it up. So this is the frequency that I'm going to actually turn my mic monitor up as well. This is the frequency that the 2000-ish hertz, cut is affecting. So it gets... This is where a lot of the abrasiveness, this is where that sits in my video, this is that weird crunchiness. I think a lot of it comes from right here. So then when I turn it all the way down, I start to lose some clarity if I go too far. But if I turn it down a little bit, like right here, it sounds pretty good. And if I go flat, you can kind of see where it's getting emphasized in your curve here. Mine's coming up around a little bit more than 2000. So I'm going to cut like right there. and that should help some of that. I'm going to leave my nasal cut because I think it's necessary for this microphone and for my voice. Now, I also wanted to look at the broadcast range because in some of the clips in my video, I didn't notice it at the time. Again, I only had so much time to work with this. But as I'm talking, there's a lot of spikes in this 500 hertz range that they call broadcast. I can't say I know what that means. I've never heard it referred to as broadcast. But again, if we crank this up, test 1 2 3, we get some weird muddiness going on here. Obviously, it's bringing up the 250 range with it. So if we turn up our Q range here, test 1 2 3. All right, by the way, the software has this little record feature down on the bottom left, so you can sample it. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky. So, like, there is something going on in those frequencies that I think is not ideal. So I set up a little bit of a cut here in my original settings to kind of remove some of that. And then it's just a matter of playing with the warmth versus the muddiness. Again, I think during my original long cut tutorial, so by the way, for that video, I recorded a software tutorial that was supposed to be quick and dirty to go in that video, and it was 20 minutes long, so I had to re-record it. But in that, I started messing around, and I was like, okay, well, what if I add my usual 250 hertz mud cut? Because I don't like that. So, you know, we set that up and cut here, and I think this is also kind of affecting because if I put it up, I get real muddy. But I think that cut also affects things. So I'm leaving it here as is. One thing that I have run into, though, is if I try to add a bass roll-off or a high-pass filter, I think it destroys the audio. And I don't like that because I think as is, I'm a little too boomy. Even if I turn off the sub bass and all of that stuff, like, I think it's a little too boomy. The issue is this microphone, much like the AT2040 I reviewed a couple months ago, it only has a frequency response of 50 hertz to 20 kilohertz, whereas most mics I cover are 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and something about that missing frequency range just really mucks with my voice. And I completely highlighted it in the AT2040 review. Like, I thought it really messed things up, and I think that's happening to me here. So I'm going to run this as an example. I'm going to add a band. I'm going to set it as a high pass filter. We're going to slide it over, somewhere over here. We don't want it to be too high that it affects our boost that we were getting. Test 1 2 3. You may disagree. Maybe that I'm listening it differently. It's going to sound a little bit better now. But I was feeling like suddenly this somehow makes it more abrasive, even though it should roll off some of that bass. I don't really know what's going on here. Like, as I roll it out here, it's just like it's hurting the audio somehow. And of course, if I come up too close, then I lose all of the warmth altogether as it starts cutting all of that out. So it's really, obviously, it takes some fine tuning to get the settings right in here. And I think that's the benefit of having all of this kind of educational tools with guides and everything. You got your loudness meters, you got your EQ, things like that. I think there's some value in that. And I love that they kind of add all this so that you can learn what you're doing. But I mean, at the end of the day, the mic sounds how it sounds. I think out of box, even in the raw audio, if we switch back to that real quick here, if we go to the raw flat audio, personally, I feel it still has that kind of tight, choked sounding feeling on my voice. Everyone's voices are different. I think I have a certain low frequency range that is a specific quality that we've come to grow accustomed with my voice that gets cut off in that missing frequency range in the frequency response. And for my voice, it sounds super tight and like squished and a little crunchy, much like a lot of the cheaper dynamics that release these days. Most modern dynamic mics that release these days sound like this, where they sound kind of compressed or whatever. Whereas the old school ones don't. And you have to play with that and work with that. But I think between that factor and the proximity effect not being in play here, it didn't sound great. So here's my walkthrough. It's not even a software tutorial. I'll still post the original software tutorial cut over on the Stream Guides channel, but this is how to make the BEACN mic sound good. I don't know. I like it, and I like the sound that I can get out of it now. I don't like eating the microphone like this. Like, this is uncomfortable. This is unnatural. I realize I think I'm becoming jaded to kind of streaming practices in that I'm moving to wanting mics out of frame or shotgun mics or lav mics that I don't have to worry about. And all my big on-camera videos are shot on shotgun mics now. And I'm kind of becoming a little, like I said, jaded to some of these practices, but I feel like a mic should be able to handle that. And that's something why I always love and go back to the Electro Voice RE20, because it doesn't have proximity effect. It has what's called variable D, in that whether it's right up on your mouth or like a foot away, as long as your environment's treated and gain's set properly and whatever, it sounds the same. And I love that mics, I love when mics do that. And I don't know. I wanted to make this video to clarify, because I was honestly kind of shocked to wake up and see so much discussion focusing on how bad the mics sound when I thought it was okay. But here you go. Hope you enjoyed. Check out the other reviews if you haven't already, and go check out the reviews of everyone that I pointed out here if you missed them. And yeah, hope you enjoyed. Remember, be kind, rewind.